The moment my 20 years of service ended wasn't marked by a retirement party, a handshake or a final signature on a stack of forms. It ended with a singular, chilling observation made less than 40 feet from the front porch of my isolated patrol cabin. It wasn't the kind of danger you could shoot, tranquilize, or log in a government report. It was the kind of fundamental, soul-stripping horror that makes you question the very ground you stand on, the air you breathe, and the sanity you've always relied upon. I was Elias Vance. For 2 decades, these sprawling, unforgiving miles of old-growth timber, deep ravines, and glacier-fed rivers were my kingdom. My office was the silence of the wilderness, and my colleagues were the grizzlies, the black bears, the elk herds, and the wind, which always seemed to have an ancient message it was trying to whisper, if only you listened hard enough. I didn't just know these woods, I was grafted into them. I knew which ancient Sitka spruce had been struck by lightning 3 seasons ago, which shallow cave held the winter sleep of a mother bear, and precisely where the soil held that rich metallic smell just before a heavy snow. I was the last line of defense against the carelessness of man, and the first responder to the ruthless indifference of nature. There wasn't an animal track, a weather pattern, or a geological anomaly in this entire sector that I couldn't identify, predict, and ultimately neutralize. I was pragmatic, cynical, and deeply, functionally fearless. Until the day I wasn't. The fear that ultimately drove me out wasn't sudden. It was an insidious, slow-motion, creeping dread, starting as a subtle disharmony in the natural rhythm of the forest, a perfect, silent chord suddenly struck with a sour note. This happened in the late fall, a time when the territory, nestled high in the borderlands, begins its transition into the suffocating isolation of winter. The air was already thin, carrying the clean, sharp scent of impending frost, mixed with the heavy, sweet decay of fallen pine needles. I had just completed my routine 12-mile perimeter check, a task I performed religiously every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, mapping and logging any signs of illegal trapping, unauthorized logging, or, most frequently, lost hikers who had tragically overestimated their own capability. It started with the silence. Not the deep, natural quiet of the remote woods, which is actually composed of 1,000 tiny noises, the drip of condensation, the crunch of mice through dry leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the shifting weight of a sleeping forest, but a vacuum. A silence that felt engineered, heavy, and purposeful. I first noticed it on the western logging trail, adjacent to the old decommissioned firebreak. I was marking the boundary when I realized my ears were ringing from the absence of sound. The usual flurry of chickadees, the constant scolding of the Steller's jays, the faint high-pitched buzz of insects, all gone. It was a silence that felt like being submerged in water, thick and suffocating. I dismissed it, of course. A shift in atmospheric pressure. Maybe a predator was moving through the area, scattering the smaller creatures, a mountain lion, perhaps, or a rogue wolf pack. I checked my sidearm, tightened the straps on my pack, and moved on, forcing the familiar rhythm of my boots on the damp earth to override the rising tide of unease. But then came the tracks. They were near a small, seasonal creek bed, the kind of place where game always congregates for water before the freeze. I was looking for deer prints, gauging the health of the local herd, when I saw them. At first glance, I assumed they were human. They were bipedal, certainly, but they were wrong. Profoundly, disturbingly wrong. My 20 years taught me forensic tracking better than any textbook. I know the gait of a drunk hunter, the panicked stride of a fugitive, the heavy, methodical step of a logger, and the precise, measured pace of a professional hiker. These prints defied classification. The depth suggested immense weight, far heavier than any man I knew, perhaps 250 or 300 pounds. Yet the stride length was impossibly long, suggesting speed and economy of motion that should have left deep drag marks or scuffed earth. Instead, the edges of the prints were clean, defined, almost pressed into the soft, muddy bank. And here was the crucial, terrifying detail. There was no discernible heel strike or toe-off pattern. It was a flat, uniform impression, almost like a massive, poorly defined paddle, leaving no indication of a natural foot structure or the complex mechanics of human balance. I knelt down, running my gloved hand over the disturbed earth, feeling the texture. The prints were moving south towards the deep, rarely visited interior, known locally as the Dark Pocket. My mind tried desperately to rationalize it. Oversized snow boots, maybe, worn by someone dragging a tremendous weight, a customized prosthetic. But even a quick analysis ruled those out. The spacing and sheer mass defied known physics of human locomotion, especially moving through that terrain. A person that heavy, moving that fast, would be stumbling, fighting gravity. This gait was flowing, continuous, silent. And then, just as suddenly as they began, they vanished. Not faded, not washed away by the creek, but simply stopped, at a point where the terrain turned slightly rocky. Whatever it was, it hadn't jumped. It had simply ceased contact with the ground, leaving no disturbance in the nearby moss or lichen. It was as if the creature or person had achieved momentary flight. I spent nearly an hour circling the area, compass in hand, mapping every detail. My initial anxiety had solidified into something cold and metallic in my gut. This wasn't a bear, not a wolf, and certainly not a human. This was a violation of the established pattern, a foreign entity operating outside the known biological and mechanical rules of my sector. I meticulously photographed the prints, noting the time and coordinates, committing to filing a detailed, if slightly cryptic, report upon my return. But even as I did so, I knew the report would sound ludicrous. Unknown bipedal pattern, high mass, impossible stride, disappeared without a trace. The problem with being a ranger is that you are trained to suppress panic and replace it with procedure. I filed the observation away as a strange anomaly and increased my vigilance, telling myself it was a rare animal mutation or a sophisticated, highly experimental bit of military technology gone astray. I tried to close the loop, to box the mystery, but the box wouldn't shut. The days that followed were characterized by a constant, low-level dread. The silence persisted, not just in that specific location, but began to bleed into the areas immediately surrounding my cabin. Usually the evenings were filled with the howl of the wind and the cacophony of the night hunters, but now the nights were characterized by a profound, echoing stillness. It was like living in the ear of a deaf god. I have faced down grizzlies without flinching. I've endured 40 below zero temperatures and navigated blinding whiteouts. I'm not susceptible to ghost stories or local legends, but this was different. This made my stomach drop because it felt intelligent, purposeful, and, worst of all, curious. I felt observed, not by the casual eye of a passing predator, but by a focused, assessing intelligence. My routine began to change subtly. I started cleaning and oiling my hunting rifle twice a day, rather than the weekly schedule. I found myself checking the reinforced latches on my windows multiple times before turning in. The isolation, which had always been my sanctuary, began to feel like a siege. The true escalation began 2 weeks after the initial sighting, just as the first hard frost settled, freezing the mud and making tracking nearly impossible. I rely heavily on my equipment, and I keep my supply shed locked tighter than a bank vault. I had a surplus of highly specific imported lithium batteries I used for my high-powered thermal imaging gear. When I went to retrieve them that Tuesday morning, the lock, a heavy-duty, weather-resistant master lock, was still firmly attached. Everything looked normal, but the batteries were gone. Not the generic AA or D cells, not the fuel canisters or the non-perishable rations, just those 4 specific lithium packs, specialized and costly, with a very unique serial number. And the unsettling part, the lock hadn't been picked, nor had the door been forced. It was locked from the outside exactly as I had left it. This suggested 2 terrifying possibilities. Either the intruder possessed a key I didn't know existed, or they had accessed the shed without needing the door at all. I meticulously checked the roofline, the foundation, and the ventilation grates. Nothing. No disturbance, no debris, only the absolute unwavering knowledge that a sophisticated, necessary piece of equipment had been extracted from a locked space without force. I immediately contacted my sector supervisor via the satellite phone, a transmission that was already fraught with static and delay due to the shifting weather fronts. I kept the report terse, mentioning a possible equipment failure or a mix-up in the supply drop, deliberately omitting the vanishing act and the impossible footprints. I couldn't afford to sound unhinged yet. I needed my replacement gear to track whatever this was. That night, sleep was impossible. The air in the cabin felt charged, almost electric. I lay in my cot, listening to the absolute geological silence outside. I had a high-powered parabolic microphone rigged outside, designed to pick up distant animal calls or human activity. Usually it was a steady stream of white noise punctuated by the occasional coyote howl or the drumming of a large woodpecker. Tonight it broadcast only silence, broken occasionally by a strange, low-frequency vibration, too deep to be thunder, too continuous to be equipment. It felt like the ground itself was humming. I tried to rationalize it as atmospheric interference, perhaps low-level seismic activity. But every time the vibration came, my dog, an old loyal border collie mix named Bear, would lift his head from his bed, his ears pinned back, letting out a low internal whimper. Bear was accustomed to everything the woods could throw at him. He'd stood his ground against a startled moose and barked down juvenile black bears. But he wasn't aggressive now. He was terrified. He wouldn't go near the back door, opting instead to press his thick body against my cot, trembling lightly, staring wide-eyed at the dark rectangle of the front window. I realized then that this thing wasn't just in the woods. It was observing the patterns of the woods, including mine. It was learning. It knew when I performed checks, it knew my supply cache, and it knew enough to neutralize my most valuable tracking tool, the thermal imaging batteries. The escalating dread culminated 3 days later, on a Thursday, the day I traditionally stayed close to the cabin, cleaning and performing necessary maintenance. I was splitting wood outside, the rhythmic, heavy thwack of the axe against the frozen oak being one of the few satisfying sounds that broke the unnatural quiet. I took a break around noon, wiping the sweat from my brow, despite the biting chill. I looked up towards the cabin, assessing the woodpile, and that's when I saw it. It was positioned squarely on the center of the small covered front porch, directly in front of the locked reinforced door, my sanctuary, my home for 2 decades. The sight instantly severed the last vestiges of my rational thought process. My hands went cold, the axe handle slick with sweat, and a primitive, scorching wave of adrenaline flooded my system, paralyzing me. It was an arrangement, a deliberate, horrifying tableau. The centerpiece was a carefully constructed pile of bones. Not scattered, chewed-on remains you might find after a predator's feast, but meticulously cleaned, stripped bare bones, arranged in a tight ascending spiral, reaching about 2 feet high. I instantly recognized the structure. They were primarily the femurs and ribs of a large buck, an animal I knew had been wandering the perimeter just last week, but the arrangement was unnatural. The spiral wasn't random. It was tight, almost geometric, suggesting immense care and precision, as if built by hands designed for fine manipulation, not tearing flesh. My gaze snapped to the top of the bone spire. That was the thing. Perched atop the fragile spiral, balancing perfectly, was an object that should not exist in the North American wilderness. It wasn't organic, and it wasn't manufactured by any human technology I had ever encountered. It was a shard of material, approximately 6 inches long, slightly curved, that absorbed the meager winter light rather than reflecting it. It was the color of deep, absolute midnight, a matte, non-metallic black that seemed to drink the light and warp the air around it. It looked and felt like polished obsidian, but upon closer inspection, it had the texture of finely woven fibers, dense and impossibly smooth. It wasn't wood, stone, plastic, or metal. It was something else, something profoundly alien to the ecosystem. This wasn't an accident, this wasn't a scavenger, this was a message. I dropped the axe. The heavy thud seemed to echo for miles in the heavy silence. This violation, this deliberate placement of a horrifying monument right on my doorstep, made 2 decades of hard-won knowledge crumble into dust. The anomaly had progressed from observation to direct communication. Whatever it was, it knew I was tracking it, it knew where I lived, and it wanted me to know that it could enter my personal space, destroy its prey, and leave a signature that defied every known law of man and nature, all without disturbing a single lock. The bones spoke of its capability, the silence spoke of its approach, the shard spoke of its origins, and the message was clear. You are the intruder now. My decision was instantaneous. It wasn't a calculated choice based on risk assessment. It was a primal gut reaction. The woods had been my home. Now they were a cage, and this thing was my warden. I was no longer a ranger. I was prey, and my position as the apex species in this territory had been violently, undeniably revoked. The fear wasn't for my life, but for my sanity, for the fundamental understanding of the world I had built over 43 years. I could not face whatever manufactured this horror. I fled the porch, my mind reeling. The sight of that black, light-devouring shard etched into my memory forever. The 20 years of service meant absolutely nothing compared to the terror of that instant. I knew I had to pack the essentials and leave, but before I did, I had to secure the evidence. The evidence that would prove I wasn't just some burnt-out old man succumbing to cabin fever. The profound questions about that material, about the intelligence behind the spiral of bones, and about what happened in the deep woods right after I sealed the cabin, you need to hear. I promise you, what I found deeper in the forest while making my desperate escape makes the sight of those bones look like a pleasant afternoon picnic. The story doesn't end with me quitting, it only begins there. Stay tuned for part 2, where I detail my frantic preparations, the strange behavior of my dog Bear, and the horrifying discovery I made during my final patrol before I ran for my life. You won't believe what happened when I tried to touch that black shard. The chill I felt when I first saw the anomaly near the cabin had nothing to do with the temperature drop that precedes a mountain dusk. It was a cold that settled in the marrow, the cold of absolute contradiction. My brain, honed by 2 decades of interpreting the quiet language of this wilderness, was encountering a grammar it simply didn't possess. I stood there, rooted to the spot where the undergrowth abruptly stopped, and ran the scenario through my internal diagnostic checklists, the same mental loops I used to predict weather shifts or track injured game. Every single variable returned an error. The clearing was small, perhaps 6 meters by 8, right where the dense thicket of spruce and young hemlock usually choked the light. But it wasn't the clearing itself that was the problem. This area sometimes suffered from sudden microbursts or localized root rot. The problem was the precision. The saplings hadn't been snapped by wind. They had been severed, not torn by the brute force of a buck or the careless swagger of a bear, but cut with a kind of surgical, inhuman accuracy. I dropped to my knees, ignoring the dampness seeping through the canvas of my trousers. I pulled out my small magnifying glass, the one I used to identify insect infestations, and began the meticulous, painfully slow sweep of the periphery. If something the size of a human or larger had done this, and the height of the severances indicated at least human agency, there would be sign. There would be pressure displacement, crushed moss, scuff marks on the underlying granite dust, or at the very least, a clear path of entry and exit. There was nothing. I spent the next 3 hours, moving inch by agonizing inch, charting the disturbed ground with the obsessive intensity of an archaeologist uncovering a lost civilization. I used dusting powder, normally reserved for analyzing the oily residue left by careless hikers on protected surfaces, hoping to catch the faint imprint of a specialized tread, or even the subtle drag marks left by heavy gear. But the perimeter was a perfect ring of baffling silence. The debris, the actual remnants of the severed trees, was gone. Not scattered, not piled, not pushed into a ravine. Gone. Think about that for a moment. This wasn't some quick chop job. To remove that volume of organic matter without disturbing the surrounding soil requires either immense precise machinery capable of levitation or the kind of fastidious manual labor that borders on the fanatical. I know the habits of loggers. They leave chips, sawdust, oil slicks, abandoned chains, and sometimes half a lunch pail. I know the habits of poachers. They leave shell casings, sometimes a bloody drag path, and inevitably a hurried, careless boot print deep in the loam. I knew the forest, and the forest told me nothing had been here. My internal voice, the one I had relied on for 20 years, began to get defensive, whispering possibilities that verged on the ridiculous. Perhaps it was a localized geological phenomenon. A weird, isolated explosion that vaporized wood but didn't scorch the neighboring bark. No, the cuts were too clean, too sharp, displaying defined angles. The cuts looked like they had been made by a massive razor-sharp wire, heated to an impossible temperature, slicing through the cellulose fibers without resistance or chatter. I moved away from the initial clearing, circling wider and wider, pushing through the brush that hadn't been touched, desperate to find the seam, the flaw in the perimeter, the one piece of evidence that would bring this back into the realm of the natural or the recognizably criminal. I scanned the remaining trees for markers, blazes, ribbons, anything, but the old growth stood sentinel, silent and unmarked. What truly started to gnaw at me, what pushed me past professional curiosity into genuine dread, was the absence of sound, which had persisted since the previous day. The standard ambient noise of the Sierra National Forest is never truly silent. Even on the coldest days there are jays, squirrels, the whisper of air through pine needles, the distant trickle of runoff. But here, inside a 100-yard radius of that clearing, there was only a vacuum. I specifically paused my breath and waited for the ubiquitous pitter-patter of small life in the understory. Nothing. The insects were gone, the rodents had vacated, and even the usual high-pitched buzz of electromagnetism that sometimes interferes with my radio was absent. It felt, profoundly, like the forest was holding its breath. The next morning, armed with my emergency pack, a high-definition camera, and a sense of growing unease that felt like grit under my skin, I decided to expand the search pattern exponentially. This wasn't a localized event. I knew instinctively that whatever had caused the disturbance near my cabin was merely a symptom. The operation, the heart of the anomaly, had to be deeper inside the reservation. I started heading uphill towards the seldom visited ridges near the old Sentinel Fire Lookout, an area notorious for dense rock formations and misleading terrain, a place where people deliberately didn't go. This was my reasoning. If you want to perform an illicit activity on a massive scale, you choose the hardest place to access and the most confusing topography. As I moved deeper, utilizing my knowledge of game trails that only the elk and I knew existed, I began to see them, subtle, almost invisible indicators that someone or something was moving through the woods with an unnatural methodology. These were not boot prints, nor were they typical broken branches. They were small, deliberate adjustments to the landscape, the kind of things only a person intimately familiar with the forest floor would notice, and only a professional tracker would recognize as intentional. The first marker I identified was a cluster of 3 small gray stones, granite and quartz, common to the area, but they were arranged in a perfect equilateral triangle, wedged firmly into the roots of an ancient juniper. I kicked at them gently. They were immovable. Someone had taken the time to set them, not just place them. 50 yards later, I found another. This time it wasn't stones, but 3 specific species of fungi, a dark shelf fungus, a vibrant orange cup fungus, and a small puffball, arranged in a precise linear configuration on a decaying log. Fungi are fragile. This arrangement would have taken delicate handling and precise placement. It was a signpost, a breadcrumb trail crafted by someone who either had infinite patience or who wasn't worried about the elements disturbing their meticulous work. My heart began to beat a heavy, insistent rhythm against my ribs. These markers weren't random. They were a complex, non-standard system of navigation. They spoke of intelligence, organization, and a profound degree of secrecy. A hiker wouldn't bother. A survivalist wouldn't risk using such fragile indicators. This felt militaristic, or perhaps something even more clandestine, a protocol. I followed this pattern for nearly 2 hours. The markers varied, sometimes a slight, almost imperceptible twist in a young vine, sometimes a single pine cone placed inexplicably apex upright on a bed of flat shale. Each time the pattern was geometrically precise, defying the inherent chaos of the forest floor. It was a pattern interrupt in the natural order of things, and it was leading me somewhere I absolutely did not want to go. The deeper I went, the more the air felt heavy, metallic, and cold. The familiar scent of pine pitch and damp earth was being overpowered by an odor I couldn't place. Something sterile, vaguely industrial, but overlaid with the sharp, clean scent of ozone, like the air after a lightning strike that had occurred only seconds ago. Finally, the meticulously placed markers converged on a specific geographical feature, a narrow, boulder-strewn defile that led into a small, bowl-shaped depression about 20 meters across, invisible from the surrounding high ground. It was perfect for concealment. I moved with the silence of 2 decades of practice, keeping low, letting the dense growth cover my approach. The moment I peered over the edge of the defile, the air left my lungs in a singular, soundless gasp. This was the source. This was why the woods were silent, why the clearing near my cabin looked like a surgeon had passed through. The bowl was not just clear of trees, it was clear of everything. It was a massive, perfectly circular depression where the earth had been meticulously sterilized. There was no moss, no loose stones, no detritus, no leaf litter. Just packed, smooth, dark earth, the kind of surface you would expect to find at a freshly graded construction site, except that this was 3,000 feet up a mountain, miles from the nearest serviceable road and impossibly flat. In the center of this impossible flat circle was a structure. It wasn't a tent or a shed or the temporary camp of a survey crew. It looked alien, both in design and material. It was low-slung, perhaps only 6 feet tall and massive, covering maybe a quarter of the circular clearing. The material wasn't wood, metal, or concrete that I recognized. It had a dull, obsidian sheen, completely non-reflective, somehow absorbing the already filtered light of the canopy above. The surface seemed monolithic, entirely seamless. There were no visible joints, no rivets, no doors, no windows. It looked less like something built and more like something grown, or perhaps deployed. My ranger training screamed at me to immediately report this, to use the satellite phone in my pack, and call for every level of intervention, local sheriff, state police, perhaps even the National Guard, because this transcended simple trespass or illicit activity. This felt like a violation of the very physics of my environment, but my professional skepticism, that annoying voice that always demands proof, held my hand back. I needed more evidence. A photograph wasn't enough. I needed to understand the mechanism of how this had been constructed, and crucially, how it was currently being operated. I watched, utterly still, for what felt like an eternity. The only sound now was the frantic, panicked drumming of my own pulse in my ears. The silence that afflicted the forest was absolute here. It was the silence of a vacuum chamber. I noticed subtle details that only amplified my confusion. Along the smooth edge of the clearing, running perhaps 3 feet in from the dense, untouched forest line, there was a series of barely visible indentations in the smoothed earth. They were shallow trenches, perfectly straight, almost hairline thin, running radially from the central structure towards the periphery, like spokes on a massive buried wheel. They looked like the scars left by something tremendously heavy being dragged out from the center, or perhaps something being inserted into the earth, but again without disturbing the soil on either side of the trench. It was surgical extraction or insertion, impossibly clean. The structure itself gave off no heat I could perceive, no vibration and no light, though I sensed, I didn't see, I sensed, a faint, rhythmic oscillation around its base, a barely perceptible shimmer in the air that seemed to distort the dense background of the pines. And then, after nearly 40 minutes of observing this bizarre, inert presence, I saw movement, not from within the structure. It remained utterly solid and opaque, but movement near it. It was small, quick, and almost entirely camouflaged. Near the base of the obsidian object, something shifted. It wasn't a man. It wasn't an animal I could categorize. It was a shape, low to the ground, moving with a series of quick, stuttering movements, utilizing the impossible flatness of the ground to glide rather than walk. It resembled a large, segmented insect, but made of the same light-absorbing, matte black material as the central structure. It was collecting something from the edge of the clearing, small dark pieces of what looked like mineral samples, and placing them into a specific area at the base of the massive object. The being, if that's what it was, never fully revealed itself. It was constantly shifting, obscuring itself with the subtle distortion field I had noticed earlier. But I saw enough of the movement, enough of the mechanical, deliberate action to know that this was not natural. This was not human activity in any sense I had ever been trained to understand. My expertise, my 20 years of interpreting this world, was a useless, antiquated language in the face of this reality. I was looking at something that defied stealth, defied heavy transport, defied common engineering, and now defied biology itself. I realized, with a wave of sickening clarity, that the forest was silent, not because the animals had left, but because they knew better than to make a sound. They were terrified witnesses, and I, the self-proclaimed protector of this domain, was now just another creature hiding in the brush, watching the impossible. I gripped the rough bark of the pine I was hiding behind, trying to regulate my breathing, trying to process the fact that this operation, whatever its purpose, had been occurring under my nose, within a day's hike of my secluded cabin, without leaving a trace of the conventional world. The initial disturbance near my home, the perfectly severed saplings, the vanished debris, wasn't the beginning of the story. It was the result of a cleaning crew meticulously erasing their temporary staging area. They were not hiding from the forest. They were eradicating any evidence of their presence from it. I needed to retreat. I needed to get back to the cabin, analyze the few photos I managed to take, and contact the outside world. But the sheer psychological shock, the realization that the ground beneath my feet was not what I thought it was, kept me frozen. I was witnessing a violation of the deep woods that was so profound, so absolute, that it rewired my entire perception of reality. My 20 years here had given me an arrogance, the belief that I knew the boundaries of the possible in this remote stretch of earth. That arrogance was now shattered, replaced by a paralyzing, cold fear. The only question that mattered now, the one that burned in my mind as I watched the segmented black shape continue its silent, sterile work, was not what they were doing, but why they were doing it here, miles from civilization, and how long they had been operating in the deep silence of the national forest, unnoticed and untouchable, and more urgently, had they noticed me? The metallic smell in the air seemed to intensify, and the rhythmic shimmer around the central object pulsed once, faintly, like a vast, unseen eye blinking slowly in my direction. I knew, absolutely, that I could not stay another second. The truth of what I had found was going to require me to abandon everything I knew, but first, I had to survive long enough to tell the story. I began my retreat, moving backwards, never taking my eyes off the monstrous silent anomaly in the center of the impossibly flat clearing, the profound source of the forest's fear. The absolute truth, the horrifying confirmation that shattered 20 years of rational experience, wasn't the sight of the structure itself, massive and impossibly black against the pines, but the immediate visceral realization that my equipment was not merely failing, it was being ignored. That structure, that monolithic slab that seemed to defy the very laws of optics by absorbing light instead of reflecting it, was not a geological anomaly. It wasn't a product of tectonic shift, nor was it the detritus of some secret military experiment. It was a scar, an intelligent intrusion, and the moment I tried to rationalize it using the framework of my profession, the entire construct of my reality began to fracture. I spent the first day, perhaps 12 continuous hours, moving around the perimeter of the clearing, like a man trapped in a feedback loop. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to retreat to the radio and call for immediate evacuation, not just for myself, but for the entire sector. Yet the Rangers' deep-seated need to document, to classify, to understand, the environmental disturbance kept me rooted. I needed proof. I needed metrics. I needed something beyond the blinding, terror-inducing visual evidence. I started with the tracks, the incomprehensible gouges I had first dismissed as massive logging equipment run amok. Now, seeing them pressed deep into the frozen loam, running right up to the base of the black monolith, I could identify the pattern, not treads but enormous uniform impressions, perfectly elliptical, repeating every 40 feet. The sheer compressive force required to leave such imprints in partially frozen soil suggested a weight beyond anything I could comprehend, not just hundreds of tons, but potentially thousands. And yet, There was no corresponding displacement of the soil, no rippling effect that one would expect from such immense mass moving through the forest floor. It was as if the weight was applied only vertically, instantly, and then lifted again, defying inertia, momentum, and every principle of mechanical stress I knew. I set up the tripod and the high-resolution survey camera. I tried to capture the dimensions. My measuring tape, a heavy-duty fiberglass model calibrated for long distances, seemed useless. I approached the nearest corner of the structure, if you could even call it a corner. The form was brutally angular, yet simultaneously curved in a way that tricked the eye. It felt like looking at a paradox materialized in dense matter. The texture was perhaps the most frightening element of all. It was not rough like rock. It wasn't porous like charred wood. It was smoother than polished basalt, colder than ice, and yet, when I extended my gloved hand and tentatively brushed the surface, it felt like nothing I had ever touched. It had a vibration, a microscopic thrum that didn't register as sound but as pressure. A low, dense resonance that traveled instantly up my arm and settled like lead in my chest cavity. I brought out the specialist gear. The thermal scanner, critical for locating warm-blooded animals or heat signatures, showed nothing. Absolutely nothing. Not a trace of ambient warmth, even though the sun had been hitting that side of the structure for hours. It registered as a perfect absolute zero, a black hole of thermal energy. That was the moment the professional denial truly broke. Everything on this planet radiates heat, even the most inert rock. A structure of that size, sitting in relative sunlight, should have been generating massive amounts of residual energy. Instead, it was absorbing it, drinking it in, leaving a chilling void in its place. I spent the entirety of the next day taking samples. I used my heavy-duty geological hammer and chisel. 20 years in the service had taught me how to break granite, how to chip away sedimentary rock, how to handle the hardest elements of the earth. But this material, it resisted every blow. The steel chisel simply skittered across the surface, leaving not a scratch, not a mark, not even a dust particle. The resulting sound was not the metallic ping of steel on stone, but a dead, low thud, a sound that seemed to be swallowed instantly, leaving the air eerily silent afterward. It was as if the structure itself was acoustically inert, consuming vibrations and light indiscriminately. This isolation was compounded by the failure of my own instruments. My satellite phone, usually reliable even in the deepest canyons, was dead. Not just without signal, but electrically dead. The battery, fully charged when I left the cabin, was drained to nothing. My handheld GPS, which relies on a constant signal from orbit, was showing my location wildly fluctuating, spiking hundreds of miles in milliseconds, rendering it useless. It wasn't a localized jamming. It was a profound targeted disruption of electromagnetic and radio frequencies radiating out from the structure itself, creating a palpable bubble of technological silence that mirrored the acoustic one I'd first noticed around the cabin days ago. The realization hit me. This anomaly wasn't just in the woods. It was actively rejecting modern technology, erasing our ability to perceive or document it accurately. It was an environmental filter, designed to maintain its secrecy. As I documented the dimensions, or what I thought were the dimensions, constantly struggling with the visual trickery, I noticed something beneath the structure that sent a chill far deeper than the thermal zero reading. About 30 feet from the base, near the cluster of trees that seemed unnaturally withered, I found organic matter. It was not the bones of a moose or the skeleton of a bear, though there were plenty of those scattered across the forest floor in the nearby silent zone. This was different. This was meticulously arranged. It consisted of dozens, perhaps hundreds, of small segmented bones, all human in origin, bleached white and arranged in a perfect concentric circle around a massive, deeply scored rock. The scoring on the rock was not natural erosion. It was a complex lattice of angular symbols, geometric and non-repeating, carved with immense precision. I knelt down, the fear now a cold, nauseating knot in my stomach. This wasn't an ancient burial ground. These bones looked recent, not fully fossilized, maybe only a decade or two old, certainly within the lifetime of my tenure here. And the pattern, the precise, unnerving circular arrangement wasn't random. It was deliberate. It was ritualistic. The discovery shifted my investigation from geology and biology into something far more terrifying: archaeology of the impossible. I was no longer observing a natural event. I was observing the consequences of an unnatural, intelligent interaction with humanity, an interaction that seemed to have ended very poorly for the humans involved. I started taking pictures with the only functional camera I had left, an old 35mm film camera, entirely mechanical, free from circuits or reliance on batteries. Click, click. The sound of the shutter seemed deafening in the unnatural quiet. I documented the symbol-laden stone and the skeletal ring, careful not to disturb the arrangement. I zoomed in on the carvings. They were deep, clean cuts, too uniform to be the work of primitive tools. They looked machined, perfect, yet conveyed an undeniable sense of ancient malevolence. As I catalogued the evidence, I felt the shift. I wasn't just observing the structure anymore. I was now under observation. The air grew heavy, thick, like breathing wet wool. The low resonance, the internal thrumming I had felt when touching the monolith, intensified. It wasn't just coming from the structure, it was surrounding me, a pervasive, silent pressure that began to affect my perception of time. Moments stretched, then snapped back. My vision blurred slightly at the edges. I stopped abruptly, heart hammering against my ribs, convinced I had heard a sound that defied the silence. It was a single, wet snap from the dense woods behind me, the sound of a large branch breaking under massive weight. Not the sound of a moose or a bear stepping on a dead limb. This was the sound of something calculating, heavy and deliberate. I spun around, bringing my rifle up, the familiar weight of the wood and steel the only thing grounding me. Nothing. The woods looked exactly as they had seconds before, the shadows long and deepening as the sun began its descent. But the sound had been real. It hadn't come from the direction of the monolith, it had come from the direction of my cabin. The realization flooded me with terror. The anomaly wasn't static. It had perceived my sustained presence, my intrusive investigation, and it was now dispatching something or someone to deal with the threat I represented. This wasn't just about documenting a strange object, it was about survival. I backed away slowly from the bone circle, keeping the structure in my peripheral vision, forcing myself to move deliberately, resisting the urge to sprint wildly into the woods. I took note of the path I had taken coming in, a barely discernible animal trail I had carefully marked with faint, almost invisible scraps of orange surveyor tape. I glanced back at the monolith. In the gathering twilight, the structure seemed to grow, the illusion of its size amplified by the shadows. The zero thermal signature meant that even my night vision goggles, useless as they might be due to the electromagnetic interference, wouldn't help me see it. It was a void of darkness, a perfect negative space in the forest. I reached my primary marked trail and paused. That branch snap was still echoing in my mind. It was a clear, unmistakable warning. Whatever intelligence resided within or near the structure knew I was attempting to compile data, and that intelligence was now moving to neutralize the collection. The bone circle confirmed the stakes. This entity didn't just scare intruders away, it consumed them, processed them, and used the remnants in its sinister rituals. I had come out here to find the reason for the silence, the missing wildlife, the strange tracks. I had found it. But I had also stepped into an ancient mechanism designed to keep secrets buried beneath tons of impervious, light-devouring material. I turned my back on the clearing, the air heavy with the internal thrumming sound that was now a constant presence in my skull. I didn't run, but I moved with the desperate, measured haste of a man who knows he is being hunted by something that is not bound by terrain or light. I kept the rifle ready, but I knew deep down that a few hollow-point rounds would be about as effective against that monolith as throwing sand at a glacier. As I pushed through the thicket, the satellite phone in my pocket suddenly gave a tiny, almost imperceptible surge of heat, a momentary flicker of life. I tore it out, scrambling to see if the battery indicator had even registered a single bar. It had. One tiny sliver of green, lasting maybe 3 seconds, followed by the rapid, sickening drain back into absolute zero. But in those 3 seconds, the phone had done something far more important than acquire signal. It had recorded a noise. I hit the playback function immediately, holding the phone against my ear, straining to hear over the mounting panic. The recording was faint, distorted by static from the structure's proximity, but unmistakable. It wasn't the sound of the branch snapping. It was something else, a repetition of the low internal resonance I felt but overlaid with a pattern, a voice, not language as I understood it. It was deep, guttural, vibrating at a frequency that made my teeth ache. It was a chant, rhythmic and slow, entirely alien. But at the end of the recording, just before the phone died again, there was a single, clear sound, a transition that chilled me to the soul. It was a sigh, a wet, deeply satisfied exhale, immediately followed by what sounded exactly like the word, repeated 3 times in slow, deliberate cadence, echoing the rhythm of the chanting, F-O-U-N-D, found, found, found. It wasn't just aware of my presence. It had calculated my position, anticipated my movements, and now it was confirming the hunt had begun. I didn't return to the cabin for sanctuary. I returned only to grab the essentials, the remaining mechanical camera, the film, the heavy bag, and enough food to last a week, and get out of the sector entirely. I knew then with absolute certainty that I would never sleep in those familiar walls again. The cabin was compromised, the forest was compromised, and my 20 years of dedication were ending not in retirement, but in a desperate, silent retreat from an enemy that defined the term unseen. The thing was moving, and it was moving towards me. I had to document the evidence and flee, or become the next concentric circle of bone around that terrible dark stone. The air down here did not move. It was still, yet simultaneously vibrating with an intensity that felt less like sound and more like acute, unbearable pressure applied directly to the inner ear. My head throbbed, and the faint, coppery scent of ozone and stale blood was so thick I could almost chew it. I was no longer walking on Earth, I was navigating the subterranean anatomy of something colossal, something that defied the bedrock of the planet itself. The passage opened into an enormous cavern, a space so vast that the powerful beam of my high-intensity light only seemed to irritate the edges of the absolute void. This was the place, the anchor point for the temporal and gravitational anomalies I had been tracking for weeks. This was the dark heart hidden beneath the innocuous cabin, the axis upon which my 20 years of logical certainty had just shattered. This wasn't a cave, it was an artificial void, a hollowed-out geometry defined by structures of impossible scale. Pillars, thicker than sequoias, rose from an unseen floor, not reaching a roof, but dissolving into the blackness above, a blackness that seemed to absorb light rather than merely lack it. The stone wasn't natural granite or limestone. It was a dense metallic basalt, smooth and polished, etched with those recurring sigils, not carved, I realized now, but grown into the material, integral to its crystalline structure. They weren't warnings, they were anchors. I moved forward, the silence deafening, punctuated only by the wet, slapping sound of my own boots on the slick floor. The temperature here was glacial, but an internal heat radiated from the core of the chamber, a slow, deep thrumming that made the air shimmer. I kept the rifle tight against my chest, though the futility of the weapon was a heavy, cold weight. Nothing made of lead and gunpowder could interact with whatever was waiting in this cosmic mausoleum. Then I saw the center. It wasn't a monster charging from the darkness. It was something infinitely worse. A stasis. The chamber floor sloped downward steeply toward a massive depression, a circular basin at least 200 yards wide, filled with a viscous, oily fluid that reflected the residual light in unsettling shades of green and sickly yellow. Submerged within this basin was the object of the gravity well, the thing causing the forest to warp and the clock hands to spin backward. It was colossal. It wasn't organic in the way we define life, but it was indisputably organized. It was partially buried, seemingly locked into the rock, yet portions of it rose above the oily surface, and seeing those portions was what finally, irrevocably broke my perception of reality. It was geometric, yes, but its geometry was fluid, constantly recalibrating itself within my limited human vision. I tried to focus my eyes, to rationalize the shapes. One moment, it was a smooth obsidian dome the size of a small mountain, radiating power. The next, my brain translated the image into something sharp, composed of impossible angles and facets that seemed to violate the basic laws of perspective. A corner would jut out and then curve inward simultaneously. Lines that should have been parallel met at a point 20 feet away, only to diverge back into parallel again. It was architecture designed by mathematics that didn't belong in our universe. This thing wasn't built by humans or even by creatures native to this planet. It was an intrusion, a vast, complex mechanism that had crashed or been deliberately placed here millions of years ago, and the forest, the mountains, the very bedrock, had grown around it, like scar tissue around a splinter. I understood then why the previous rangers had vanished, why the records had been purged, and why the cabin was located precisely on that useless, abandoned logging road. The cabin was the lid on the jar. The seals, the strange markings I'd tracked, were the failing sutures holding reality together around this monumental anomaly. I crept closer, fighting the nausea induced by the conflicting visual data. The air pressure increased again, and a low, resonant tone, so deep it vibrated in my skeleton, not my eardrums, began to emit from the basin. The oily fluid pulsed, disturbed not by motion, but by the internal stresses of the object within. Lying on a narrow ledge overlooking the basin, carved into the basalt wall, I finally found the records. Not the clean, mundane logs of the Forest Service, but thin, crumbling scrolls of metal foil, densely inscribed with the same intricate, inhuman script I had seen carved on the cabin door. These were the true chronicles. My mind, racing on the adrenaline of pure terror, struggled to process the alien syntax, but the images were universal, sketched onto the foil. Astronomical maps showing constellations that don't exist in our night sky, schematics of the containment structure, and, most horrifyingly, pictorial representations of life cycles. The being submerged in the oil was not dead, it was in hibernation. Or, perhaps more accurately, it was in a state of suspended animation, placed here deliberately by others, the Keepers, as the script seemed to identify them, using a symbol that resembled a constellation of 6 impossibly bright stars. The logs detailed the maintenance cycles of the containment field. They were old, older than recorded human history. They spoke of the entity requiring sustenance to remain quiescent, not food but energy, specifically drawn from localized gravitational and temporal instability. The forest was its battery. And then I saw the final entry, scratched desperately onto a torn section of foil. The dating system was complex, but the message was clear, universal in its panic. The seals are failing. The pattern recognition is breaking down. The wake is imminent. And below that, it has begun to feel the surface. The rhythmic pulsing in the basin intensified. The low-frequency rumble transitioned into something sharper, a high-pitched, grinding shriek that clawed at the walls of the cavern. It was a sound of mechanical awakening, and it resonated with a terrible familiarity. It was the sound I had sometimes mistaken for deep seismic activity back in my cabin, the sounds that had started shortly before the disappearances. I knew with a certainty that reached into the marrow of my bones that I was witnessing the climax of a containment event, spanning millions of years. I risked a glance back at the object. The impossible geometry was shifting faster now, and I could feel the subtle tug. The familiar pressure that signaled the localized gravity anomaly was increasing exponentially. It wasn't just pulling on my body. It felt like it was pulling on the structure of my perception, trying to integrate me into its alien mathematics. And then I saw the eye. It wasn't a biological eye, but a fissure, a vertical split in the obsidian surface of the submerged mass. Within that fissure, there was not light, but an absolute condensed blackness, a gravity well of pure observation. It rotated slowly, deliberately focusing on the small, insignificant human figure standing on the ledge. In that instant, I was not merely observed, I was catalogued, understood, and categorized as irrelevant. The sheer, crushing intelligence behind that silent observation was the most terrifying thing I have ever encountered. It wasn't malice, It was indifference on a scale that dwarfed galaxies. This thing did not hate us, or fear us, or even acknowledge our sentience. We were dust motes caught in the inevitable expansion of its awakening. My heart hammered against my ribs, a desperate drum against the vast, eternal silence of the abyss. Every instinct honed over 2 decades of wilderness survival screamed one imperative: run. I spun around, dropping the metal scrolls, the fear overriding the scientist, the ranger, the rational man. I scrambled back toward the narrow passage, not caring about the noise, propelled by the primal need to escape the crushing presence behind me. As I fled, the ground beneath me shook violently. Not a tremor, but a massive displacement of rock. The entire cavern was shifting. I could hear the grinding of the basalt pillars, the sound like continents colliding. The seal was broken. I plunged into the narrow tunnel, crawling, scrambling, the air growing hotter and thicker. I didn't stop to use the rope. I hauled myself upward using the handholds and the sheer force of terror, scraping my hands bloody on the rough-cut stone. When I burst out of the disguised entrance beneath the cabin floor, gasping for the relatively clean, pine-scented air of the surface, the transition was jarring. The forest above looked suddenly mundane, fragile, temporary. I slammed the hatch shut, bolted the locks with trembling hands, and then, completely consumed by an unhinged panic, I ran outside and threw the large granite grinding stone, the one that activated the mechanism, off the porch and into the dense undergrowth, hoping to buy myself a few minutes of incomprehension if anyone else ever stumbled upon the cabin. I didn't pack. I didn't salvage my gear. I didn't even grab the rifle I had left propped against the stovepipe. All I did was jump into the truck, key the ignition and drive. I drove like a man possessed, the truck bouncing violently over the rutted, forgotten logging roads. I kept checking the rearview mirror, not for pursuit, but for the distortion. I watched the tree line until the familiar ancient silhouettes of the evergreens gave way to the patchy scrub brush of the foothills, and then the asphalt of the paved road. As I drove further away, the physical symptoms subsided. The crushing pressure in my head eased, the tingling dissipated, and the internal tremors slowed. But the memory, the vision of that impossible geometry and the colossal indifference of that ancient, waking intelligence remained crystal clear. It was etched onto the inside of my eyelids. I drove straight through the night and into the nearest town, a small, forgettable place 60 miles from the boundary. I checked into the cheapest motel and sat on the edge of the bed until dawn broke, watching the weak light filter through the dusty blinds, waiting for the sky to tear open. The decision to quit wasn't a moment of resignation. It was an act of survival. I couldn't go back. I couldn't lie about what I saw while knowing that structure was shifting beneath the ground. I couldn't be a sentinel for a world that was oblivious to the vast existential horror that had been sleeping beneath its feet. My resignation was handled with the utmost bureaucratic simplicity. I called Supervisor Harris 2 days later. "Personal reasons, Harris," I said, my voice sounding strained and hollow even to my own ears. 20 years is a long time. I need out." Harris was predictably annoyed. "But the paperwork for the boundary anomalies, the seismic activity? We need your observations, Chief." I looked at the cheap, beige wallpaper of the motel room and formulated the perfect, innocuous lie. "I think the boundary sensors were faulty, Harris. That whole section of the range is due for an upgrade. I filed the report suggesting it was just geological settling. Bad data, Chief. Nothing more." I minimized everything. I fabricated explanations for the ground scarring, attributing it to recent logging activity from an adjacent tract. I failed to mention the cabin, the seals, the impossibility. I didn't dare mention the eye. Harris accepted it, grumbling about replacing me, but he accepted the neat, tidy narrative of equipment malfunction and ranger burnout. It was easier than confronting the alternative. Now, I live far from the mountains. I took the small payout and moved to a city, ironically a place where the noise and the sheer number of people offer a peculiar kind of psychological insulation. But I can't look at maps the same way. When I see a remote green patch on satellite imagery, especially one marked with outdated logging trails, my stomach clenches. I spend hours reading old myths, not the sanitized fairy tales, but the primal, forgotten texts about what sleeps in the dark corners of the world, what ancient civilizations were actually guarding against. I look at news reports of deep-sea trenches and unexplained magnetic fluctuations. Every time there is an unusual earthquake in the Pacific Northwest, my hand instinctively reaches for the radio dial, waiting for the inevitable report of catastrophic ground shift. I left the forest, but the forest didn't leave me. The sheer scale of what I saw, the realization that we are merely living on the roof of a cosmic prison, is a permanent weight. The entity is awake. I don't know what its timetable is or what the ultimate consequences of its full emergence will be. Perhaps the keepers knew that once the seals failed, all we could do was wait. But I know one thing for sure. The woods are watching, and the silence is merely the pause before the world learns that there are things far older, far vaster, and infinitely more terrifying than we ever allowed ourselves to imagine, stirring beneath the quiet moss and the ancient pines. I quit because staying meant becoming a witness to the end. And a witness is just a victim who hasn't been processed yet. I told Harris that the data was just bad. I told myself that for a while too. But the truth is out there, deep beneath the surface, and its geometry is entirely, irrevocably wrong. And that is why I need to know. Has anyone else encountered impossible geometry in the wilderness? Have you felt the wrongness of the pressure? If you have seen the sigils, the metallic basalt, or felt the ground hum when there's no wind, I need you to share this story. If we don't talk about it now, when the time comes, no one will be left to listen. Tell me what you saw. Tell me before the quiet returns for good.